spend a little bit of time on trees and turf. And again, we were light on turf questions, but heavy on trees. So we decided to put those together today. And so we'll just kind of kick things off. We had several questions about resprout with trees, either a tree that they were trying to have cut down, or I know one in particularly was paper mulberry, I think, Lee. And they were just asking, what can we do to keep these suckers from popping up everywhere? They're trying to get rid of them. What are the thoughts that we have on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, first and foremost, I would say when we do remove a tree, remember the stump, of course, is part of that tree. So if we don't grind that stump, which I assume none of the stumps were ground, we had a couple of emails about this year. If that stump's not ground, certainly that root crown is going to sucker or create sprouts. Remember, trees are long-lived organisms that ultimately sprout in response to a disturbance. So, of course, a tree removal is a disturbance for a tree. So we are likely to see those sprouts form. Now, since the stump wasn't ground, I guess you're really stuck with two options. We're past grinding of the stump. So we have mechanical removal of the sprouts. We can do that through regular mowing intervals, of course. That's one way. We can go out and hand pull, use shovels and axes, or maybe even a forestry mulcher, or bring back in a stump grinder to actually sever that main stump from the individual radial roots that extend out. But what's critical to understand, and I know you both have been battling these sprouts, is that you simply cannot let that new foliage develop into a fully inflated leaf. Remember, back to photosynthesis, we're taking light energy and we're creating sugars to ultimately store into starches for later use. So if we're letting that foliage actually inflate, we're being counterproductive. We have to get those sprouts the second they come out of the ground. So that's our first option, just mechanical. Of course, we could utilize a cut stump treatment with a herbicide. We would take a systemic herbicide that would be applied directly to that cambium layer after we make the cut on any of those sprouts. We want to do that immediately after cutting, and ultimately that chemical will be taken down into the roots. Now, cut stump treatments can be done most any time of year, but right now is really our go-to time because trees are taking photosynthates and pushing them down into their root system and the crown of that tree trunk. So common active ingredients for cut stump treatments include glyphosate, triclopyr, picloram, 2,4-D, imazapyr. But you buy the smallest amount that you can find. We're talking about a little bit applied to a paintbrush right on that cambium layer. And I think finally, Celeste, the thing to remember is this is not going to be a one and done treatment. You're going to have to closely monitor these sprouts, and reapplication may be applied for, both scenarios. You may have to prune them for 2 or 3 years before you actually run that root system out of sugars to create new sprouts.
So
awesome.
Add in, Lee mentioned this about that cut stump. The fall of the year before leaf color change is the most ideal time to do that, because those plants are translocating the most amount of sugars down into the root system. And so our herbicides are most effective during the fall of the year on those perennial plants.
Oh, that is an excellent point. I would never have thought of it in that, that mechanism. That makes perfect sense. I've always heard the best time to treat kudzu is at that time of year, and that's why, because it's sending all of that directly to that root system.
That's why any perennial plants, whether it be wild violet in a turf or trees, we're trying to treat those in the fall of the year because they are moving more energy down. In the springtime, all that energy is coming up. You don't get as good a movement to the root system, and so you may not get a very good kill at all on those plants. That's just right. Total opposite of an annual type plant, but with our trees, we're talking about a perennial plant. In fall, before the foliage change, is the best time.
Awesome. Lee, we had another question on here about, I know we hate to mention it, but the dreaded Leland cypress, which we don't recommend that you plant, by the way, but we do commonly see issues with them. And even above Leland cypress, we have seen widespread browning of many evergreens and ornamental landscapes this year, specifically arborvitaes. Which used to be our replacement plant for Leland's. So a lot of different things have been going on there, but if you could address this question, I'll kind of read it out for everybody so they know what we're dealing with. But it says, their Leland cypress trees are about 7 years old. They have rather rapidly turned brown. They use the trees as a screening, several yards. They're planted several yards apart, but all have succumbed to whatever this problem is. And they go on to talk a little more about the canopy and then ask for any suggestions on alternatives.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, you mentioned Leland's not being an ideal specimen. And I think the main reason why that is because Leland's really are drought intolerant, meaning that they have to have a constant supply of water. The Lelands that I've seen do best are usually in landscape beds that have drip irrigation. But once a Leland cypress tree gets stressed, be it from an insect or a disease, they become even more, an environmental factor, they become more susceptible to fungal infections. We see Ceridium canker a lot, Botrys dieback, and Passiflora needle blight. But we also have bagworms and spider mites and scale insects that love Lelands as well, especially stressed ones. So, what was the cause of death here? I suspect it being water. If you're in East Tennessee, I would really go that route because I believe it was August, we had 1.1 inch and September, we had 1.5 inch of rainfall. So that's just not enough to really create viable, Leland cypress trees. So I don't know what necessarily killed these trees. We could send samples to a diagnostic lab, but it's unlikely to be the soil. I think that was part of that question. Should I dig up the soil? I don't think that is the case, but I think you are asking the right question in what are good replacements. And first and foremost, I know all of us on this committee would all discourage a monoculture planting where we take one species and we put 25 of them in a row. We know diseases and insect pests that come into those systems have multiple hosts available. So instead, shoot for a diverse landscape, one that has many different evergreen species, really. The challenge, I think, for this individual is going to be that they did mention they were under the canopy of a hardwood forest. So many of our evergreen species do want 6 to 8 hours of sunlight a day. Now, without this, you can still plant in this area, but they'll grow slower. They may become a little leggy or sparse over time. So what species do you pick? Well, we have publications for that, but I'll mention a few. Holly is always one of my big go-tos for people that are in dense shade because they don't care quite as much. Eastern red cedars can be an option. Arborvitae, as Celeste mentioned, Cryptomeria, Chamaeopsis, any number of junipers or pines. We have cedars that do well. And here in East Tennessee, we can get by with some Norway spruces. Now, these are all fairly large trees, so maybe that's too large for you. You might consider shrubs, or you might consider a tiered landscape where you implement some loropetalums or viburnums, camellias, acuba, rhododendron, yews, Alyssium. I mean, there's any number of plants, but what I will encourage, Celeste, and I'll wrap up on this, is that the publication Screen Plants for the Tennessee Landscape is a newer publication that really talks about the diversity and how we can better overcome insect and disease pressures. So look at that publication. I'll be happy to put it in the chat box, and it lists numerous species and the size of those individuals. So
awesome. Thank you so much.
yes.
Hey,
Okay.
I'd like to piggyback one thing on what he's talking about on that water. I always tell homeowners the first 3 years, make certain you water them in. Don't plan on them getting enough water because most trees or shrubs that die within the first 3 years are a product of drought or too much water, one of the two, and transplant stress or a combination of both. So pay attention to the water. And once some of those plants dry out, if they get really hydrophobic, you may come back in water and they may not take up that water just because they've become hydrophobic in that bed.
All right, good conversation. So I'm going to lightly touch on the fact that we did have a question about crepe myrtles and the leaves and the stems turning black. And so that sounds like crepe myrtle bark scale. And we have some great resources that can help you, learn more about identifying crepe myrtle bark scale, learning how to treat crepe myrtle bark scale. And the best time to treat that pest is not this time of year because the plants are going into dormancy. We want to treat those with a systemic insecticide that will help rapidly take that up and out to other parts of the plant. So that's going to be like early spring, right as those plants are beginning to flush out. So we will make sure and talk in depth about crepe myrtle bark scale in the early part of 2023. So if you're looking for action steps to do now, you can certainly scrub the big main trunks with a soft bristle brush and dishwash detergent water mixture. If you just want to get that sooty mold blackness off, it'll wash right off. Because I know that's not real pretty, especially if you're trying to make the outside of your home attractive for the holidays. That could be an option, and dormant oil sprays could help with a little bit of control. But the number one proven control method for crepe myrtle bark scale is through a systemic insecticide drench. So we'll talk more about that in the spring of 2023. So let's hit on just a few minutes about some grass questions and things that we need to be thinking about in our turf. Mitchell, we had a question come in at the very beginning into the chat box that said, is now the time to be using pre-emerge for Poa annua in lawns?
Well, so Poa started germinating, several weeks ago. I expect it's probably still germinating. It's not all germinated yet. So that's already germinated. Pre-emerge won't have any impact on. But if you've got areas, for example, if you have warm season grass that's just now going dormant and going to open it up where Poa could germinate, sure, you probably have some benefit from using the pre-emerge on it now. And I think the question also said, would they be better off using post-emerge? Well, you have a lot of options from the post-emergent standpoint, especially on full season grass. So the better job, the better control you can get with pre-emerge, the better off you're going to be on the warm season turfs that do have Poa breakthroughs. Once that turf is dormant, then you can use maybe a grass herbicide on it to knock the Poa that. Something that's got step up for doing it, for example, would be a product that you could use in a full season grass. From a post-emergent standpoint, you just don't have much good option out there from a post control already emerged, already germinated, growing Poa.
Awesome. Good answers for that. Yeah, I struggle with that too. I feel like I always have it popping up a lot along the edges of my like my landscaped areas because it's bare, right? It doesn't have cover of my turf, and that's the area that I keep separated, and so it's like a solid border of Poa annua. Oh goodness. So what about, I know we mentioned earlier, we were discouraging people from fertilizing, trees, ornamental things that are going into dormancy at this time of year. But in Middle Tennessee and Eastern Tennessee, we have more cool season grass, lawns and managed turfs. What are some management tips that you have for those types of situations?
So from a fertility standpoint, cool season grasses, the bulk of the fertilizer probably is better served. You're better served if you put it out in the fall. So that September, October, November time frame is a good window for that. If you've got a soil test and you see that you need phosphorus and potassium, sure, fall is an excellent time to put it up. And then nitrogen, if you've not done a nitrogen application, in this fall period, then, strive for somewhere in the neighborhood of a pound of that nitrogen per 1,000 feet of yard area. Well, how much fertilizer does it take? Depends on the fertilizer you use. A simple way to remember that is divide what you want by what you got. So if what you want is a pound, what you've got is a 20% nitrogen fertilizer. Divide 1 pound by 0.2, 20%. It tells you 5 pounds of that fertilizer gives you a pound of nitrogen. So regardless of what the nitrogen analysis is on the fertilizer product, divide that 1 pound by that percentage, and that'll tell you how many pounds that fertilizer is. And the same thing is true for the field. Okay, recommend using 1/2 pound of phosphorus or 1 pound of potash, whatever. You can achieve that with any fertilizer that has those elements in there. You just have to adjust the rate. So, don't just arbitrarily start throwing phosphorus and casting out. You're better served, I think, to use that in a soil test failure that you have a deficiency of those when using at that point. And if you do have a deficiency, this fall period is a great time to do it. One final thing I'll mention, I know our time is very short. From a weed control standpoint, on cool season grasses, warm season grasses, both, winter annual leaves germinating, up and growing. I'm seeing them dip. It's already blooming purple, so it's pretty far advanced. But if you did some overseason, cool season turf, you very well could have encouraged some wind bitten, some chickweed germination, some of those winter annuals to germinate because you disturbed the soil and pulling those seeds close to the surface. It's not the end of the world. Once those seeding grasses get some level of maturity and they start to fill it, you can be successful using post-emergent products on those broadleaf weeds. In the late fall, the early winter time, you got some products that have good cool season or good cool weather efficacy. I'm saying temperatures, down in the 50s. It doesn't have to be 60 degrees or 70 degrees in order for it to work. But from the brand standpoint, there are multiple brands. Speed Zone is one that comes to mind. Low Nine's got one called Weed Beater Ultra. But those that have some potential zone in them tend to show better cool weather efficacy. So on a sunny day, you got temperatures in the 50s, even in the high 40s, you can get pretty good results by using those products on those broadleaf weeds. Just so long as your newly emerged, newly seeded turf grass has gotten mature enough. And they'll tell you on the product label. Typically it'll say, X number of weeks after planting or after the grass has been mowed 3 times or 4 times or something like that. So it'll give you good information there to decide whether or not your grass is mature enough to withstand that application of herbicide. And so if you kill them in the winter, you don't let them stay there all winter and then you put out all those seed next year. Start breaking that seed cycle a little bit and reducing the amount of seed in the soil seed bank over time. And maybe over time, just diminish that population as we have to face it.
All right. And we had a question come in while you were explaining that to us, Mitchell, that said, what is this weed y'all are talking about? And so I put it in the chat box. So Poa Anna or annual bluegrass is,
depending on where you live, it might be Poa.
Yeah, right. Depending on where you're from, sounds a little different for a few ways to say it. But it's the little tuft grass. It has really fine leaves and kind of silvery seed heads. It's a really cute little thing that turf managers despise. So
it'll produce a seed. When it's 2 inches tall, it'll start putting seed heads out.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for being here today. I think that was a good way to kind of wrap up our sessions for the day. Thanks again for sending in all the questions and being interactive on the chat box. We've had a great time doing these office hours with y'all this year and look forward to continuing to do it in 2023. And just want to ask y'all to help us spread the word. We want to invite gardeners from all areas of the state to join in on our office hours questions. And so thanks for being here.
One last thing, Celeste. This has been brought to you by the University of Tennessee Extension, and go Vols.
Go Vols.
Beat the dogs.
Have a great weekend.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.